Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank the African Development Bank and our partners in the African Investment Forum for this opportunity. So we just watched that short clip, and that kind of sets the scene for us. So, good evening again, distinguished guests. As we are now less than a week away from COP27, the first COP on African soil since 2016, it is paramount that we in the investment community articulate a clear vision of what we all can do to propel Africa's role in the race to global net zero. So let's begin. What's our role? I think it's good to set a little context here. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with the result of the research they've undertaken, and the results were quite stark. It led the UN Secretary General to say that there has been no action taken and that we're on a path to an unlivable world, and that what we have is a litany of broken promises on climate. So that's really what we're dealing with. And we all know that in this big crisis that the world is about to embark upon, Africa is the least contributor to carbon emissions. Specifically, the average person in Africa uses 180 kilowatts of electricity per hour. That is less than 3% of the 6,500 kilowatts per hour consumed by the average European, and just about 1.3% of the 13,000 kilowatts per hour per American. Therefore, unlike other regions, we cannot reduce power consumption. But that is not to say that Africa doesn't have a role to play in cutting harmful emissions. In fact, we have a major role to play. Why? 4 out of every 5 persons in sub-Saharan Africa use firewood, charcoal, or kerosene to cook. These fuels produce black carbon, which contributes to more than 500,000 premature deaths every year, as well as stunted growth and increased risk of respiratory infections in children under 5. Population growth means problems from this cooking fuel will only get worse. Providing cleaner fuel for cooking reduces harmful emissions, as well as reducing the race to global net zero for Africa. Essentially, preserving our forests is a key responsibility for the entire globe. Why? We know that African forests absorb about 1,500 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So essentially in Africa, we've been absorbing carbon emissions for centuries. And because emissions have no borders, carbon emissions in America, in Europe, in Russia, they are absorbed in Africa and in every other tropical forest around the world. So preserving our forests is a responsibility for the world. People having to chop trees to cook is the key reason why Africa has the world's fastest rate of forest depletion, which means deforestation. Right now, our tropical and montane forests absorb carbon emissions equivalent to the emissions from 320 million cars. Essentially, the forests in Africa absorb the emissions of literally all the cars in the US and more. Therefore, we must work with the global community to protect these carbon sinks by assigning realizable economic value to preserving our forests. We must also encourage African leaders to stop selling cheap carbon credits or giving rights to people to buy carbon credits in future for a price that is so low today, especially because we know the amount that is spent on carbon capture and storage. If we look at the two, we know that we're selling forests cheap, and we should stop doing that. A past, even more significant contribution for net zero is a reduction of global shipping. If the global shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest greenhouse emitter after China, US, India, Russia, and Japan. Reducing shipping requires a complete rethink of the way African economies have operated for centuries. Essentially, our current practice of just producing raw materials for export and processing in other parts of the world and shipment to other parts of the world, including back to Africa, is what we must change. This is the reason why structural transformation has not occurred on the continent. It's the reason why we have several cycles of boom and bust. When commodity prices do well, we all do well, and anytime there's volatility, we all suffer. We have currency depreciation, we have devaluation, we have high public debt, as we're experiencing now in most other African countries. Rather than exploiting our natural resources to Asia for processing only to import them as finished goods, we must invest in local production and processing in Africa. This includes the minerals and metals necessary to achieve the global energy transition. This is an important point to note. I was talking to a group earlier in the day, and I was trying to make them imagine the scale of minerals and metals that will be required going forward. If you think about it, an electric car requires 6 times more minerals and metals than an internal combustion engine car, which we use normally today. A gas turbine and a wind turbine, if you compare the amount of minerals and metals that goes into each, a wind turbine requires 11 times more minerals and metals than a gas turbine. So just imagine the transition that we are all embarked upon, and the fact that we need to replace gas turbines with wind turbines, we need to replace internal combustion engine cars with electric cars. Right now, I think we have about 8 million electric cars. We're projected to have 100 million, rising to 300 million in the future. So just imagine the scale of minerals and metals that will be required for that transition to take place. And imagine the amount of mining that will be required. It can't be that we're going to ship all of those to Asia for processing and then to the rest of the world. That's not viable. We will never achieve net zero with that kind of business model. So this is the way we have to rethink how we operate in the world today. And it turns out that this is the opportunity that Africa needs to achieve structural transformation going forward. Ending Africa's economies away from primary resource export towards secondary and tertiary industries is the most effective way to align our continent with global net zero without sacrificing economic growth. This is why we have recently published a white paper called Roadmap to Africa's COP, a pragmatic path to net zero. Here we're arguing and advocating for the world, especially African leaders, to have consensus on the pathway for Africa towards net zero, and for the world at large as well towards net zero. I urge you all to read that paper, where we prescribe local manufacturing as the first of 3 significant areas of change that are required for achieving net zero. These priorities include localizing industry on the continent, and for that, it means that we do processing on the continent, which is the reason why we have always embarked on how can we have more value capture on the continent. We have invested in special economic zones, in industrial parks across the continent. They've been successful. They've created jobs. They've increased exports. They've allowed for foreign companies to come and locate in Africa, essentially improving prosperity. We think we need to do that at scale, and such initiatives is what will help achieve net zero going forward. It's also what will help develop the African continent. It has been so successful that we are replicating the same model in Benin, in Togo, and tomorrow, inshallah, in Nigeria, we shall be commissioning a few projects in Ogun State towards that effect, and we have several of such in the Republic of Chad, Republic of Congo, here in Côte d'Ivoire, as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, the industrial zone that we have has been certified as the first carbon-free industrial zone in the world. This is our Gabon Special Economic Zone. This is important because we're showing that even when we do the local processing in Africa, we can do it in a clean, sustainable way. So the way to go is for us to have a lot more of these industrial activities in Africa. Why? Because in Africa, we have a variety of renewable sources of energy that we can use. We can use hydro, we can use wind, we can use solar. But especially, our industrial zone relies mainly on hydropower. So SGS has certified it as the first carbon neutral industrial zone in the world as we speak, which is the reason why we're replicating this investment across the continent. The second focus for us is on rebuilding infrastructure. Africa is significantly coastal. We are currently suffering the most devastating impacts of climate change. Our infrastructure was not built to withstand the effects of climate. So we need to rebuild this infrastructure. We need to climate-proof Africa's infrastructure in a way that they can withstand the effects of climate change. In the same report I referred to earlier, it has been declared that if we don't take action in climate-proofing infrastructure, the loss caused by structural damage is going to increase to 415 billion by the year 2030, up from about 220 billion currently. Africa's economy, about 35% is at risk to climate change. We need to reverse this by climate-proofing infrastructure on the continent. This is why we are launching an infrastructure climate resilience fund that seeks to raise capital, from several parts of the world using the blended finance model to climate-proof infrastructure on the continent. One third area of importance, as we set out in our paper, is financial innovation. This is how we can work together to raise the capital and convert the various pledges that have been made for investment. Essentially, we're arguing that we need to move from aid, we need to repurpose aid budgets for insurance and guarantees in a way that we can use that to mobilize additional capital. This is also a way of managing Africa's prejudice premium. We all know that the perception of risk in Africa is inflated, and that empirical studies by international rating agencies show that Africa has the lowest default rate in infrastructure. At the press briefing earlier today, the president mentioned those. I don't want to repeat them here, but it's empirical evidence. We are not as risky, but we're paying so much more. A way to manage this is using blended finance, using non-payment insurance to reduce all of this risk. So while we're arguing for change, we've also done our part. We've done our part by building renewable assets across the continent. We built the first wind farm in Cape Verde, provides 20% of the energy requirements of the island. We're building a hydro dam here in Côte d'Ivoire that will reduce electricity tariffs significantly. We're building a wind farm in Djibouti as well that will replace imported fuel from Ethiopia. We have invested in the largest renewable company in Africa with over 1,000 megawatts, and we have a pipeline of increasing that. We have projects in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Egypt, in South Africa. Now, the thing to note is that Africa has 60% of the best solar sources globally, yet less than 1% is built. At the same time, Africa has 5,000 billion cubic meters of natural gas, which the International Energy Association says that if we develop all of the natural gas that we have for the next 30 years, we would only increase our emissions from 3 to 3.5%. So that shows that we must continue to develop natural gas as a transition fuel. We must continue to see how we can invest in industry and prosperity for our people. I want to stop here. I thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.